This podcast is going to be me talking about a single scientific paper written by 5 researchers. The title of the paper is Misinformation and Its Correction: Continued Influence and Successful Debiasing. And it's just about how if somebody is misinformed, how do you fix that? How do you make them so they're no longer misinformed? And they talk about all the things that can go wrong and how sometimes trying to correct somebody actually makes them more, it makes it worse. They're now even more misinformed. So doing it right or doing it using the best knowledge available on how things work is what this paper is about. How do you do that? So I'm just going to, it's a very scientifically written paper, very academic. It's written for other scientists. Not pleasant to read, kind of a struggle to read, but as I read it and understand it, I will just come on here and tell you what I'm finding out. Okay, here we go. The first thing to point out is that they're not telling you, here's how you change somebody's mind. They're telling you what the science says about how minds are changed and what works and what doesn't, at least according to the experiments that have been done so far. So it's probably not comprehensive. It's probably not the last answer, but there's at least some things in here that would be useful for those of us who are trying to disabuse somebody of a conspiracy theory or whatever. Whatever you're trying to do that's trying to correct somebody's misinformation, this information should help you. I should point out that the main goal of the researchers that wrote this paper is to correct misinformation. So they believe that a democratic society should base their decisions on correct information. And when misinformation becomes widespread, then people don't make good decisions, or at least decisions that are not based on facts. And they were trying to find out what society could do, or what individual people could do, or what could be done with public service announcements that could correct misinformation. The first thing they point out is that most people that have the same goal of trying to correct misinformation assume that it's just that people don't have enough information, and so they try to give them more information. And these researchers are saying, after looking into it, that is not the case. That's not why people have misinformation, because they don't have enough information. The researchers of this paper are basically saying that in order to correct somebody's misinformation, you first need to know how the mind deals with information and how worldview can affect somebody's motivation for taking in new information or correcting what is incorrect. And one of the first things researchers have found is that it is very hard to correct somebody's misinformation. Once they already have that as information, it's very hard to correct it. Plenty of studies have been done on this. Once somebody thinks they know something, it really resists being changed in somebody's mind, even if they don't have any motivation to do it. And once you add something like a worldview, the influence of their own worldview that motivates them to believe that, then it's even more difficult. And this is really relevant to what my goal is here, is to learn how you would correct somebody that is a conspiracy theorist. I've done a couple of podcasts before this about conspiracy theories and the people who believe them. And if you're trying to correct somebody's misinformation who's a conspiracy theory enthusiast, you, I'm sure, have found that it is almost impossible. They are dead set on their point of view. So how would you change that? That's what we're trying to find out here. For most people that you know that are conspiracy theory lovers, probably you don't care. You're like, whatever, believe what you want to believe. But if it's somebody you care about, then you might have some motivation to want to change it. So the question is, what can be done? And one of the things the researchers have pointed out is that it has to be done well, or what you do can actually strengthen the person's belief in whatever you're trying to correct. And I'm sure you've had that experience too. When the more you argue with somebody, the more dead set they seem on their point of view and on their belief in their own set of information. So the question really is, how can you change somebody's point of view, and how can you do it without making it worse?
They basically pointed out there's two reasons why when you try to argue with somebody, it makes it worse. One is just, they call it the backfire effect, that you're trying to correct somebody, and what you end up doing is making them even more committed to their original point of view. They said part of it is the familiarity effect. The more familiar you are with some piece of information, the more you believe it. So by arguing with it, you're making them go over the material again. Even you might even be pointing out something, saying something that they believe, and so they're going over the material again. It's becoming even more familiar to them. So that by itself, even absent their motivation to hold on to it, it still strengthens their belief in that set of beliefs. And the other way that this can strengthen their belief in their ideas is that if what you're attacking, or if what you're trying to correct, is a belief that matches their worldview, people are really resist something that threatens their worldview. And so this causes them to really defend their point of view, their ideas, and their worldview. So by saying something that might make them question their worldview, you can make them really entrench themselves in their position. The backfire effect. One of the experiments they did to demonstrate or discover something about the backfire effect is people were shown a flyer that debunked common myths about flu vaccines, for example. After they read the flyer, they were asked if they could tell the difference between the myths and the facts, and they could. But then they waited 30 minutes. Some of them tested worse on the test than they did to begin with. In other words, some of those myths got reinforced in their minds. But that is the effect of the familiarity. So by going over the myths in the flyer and then taking a test, they went over it again. And then 30 minutes later, what was strongest in their mind is a myth that they may have heard of before, and now it's become even more familiar. So they believed it. So one of their practical suggestions is that if you're going to be talking to somebody about a misinformation that they have, to not go over their misinformation when you talk about it, to talk about the new information and not reinforce or make more familiar what they already believe. Here's an example of how that works. Now, if you think it's a red balloon and I say it's not a red balloon, what I just made you do was make an image in your mind of a red balloon. So I've just kind of reinforced it and made it even more familiar, that idea. And then 3 days later, when somebody asks you about it, you remember an image of a red balloon. So you're like, I think it's a red balloon. So they're saying, if you're talking to somebody, don't say, no, it's not a red balloon. Say, no, it's a blue balloon. And they said, and you can make that even stronger by reinforcing it or saying it several times during the conversation to reinforce the image of the blue balloon or reinforce whatever information you're trying to get across. And that's more likely to debunk, in their mind, the misinformation they already had. So try to avoid repeating any information that is false, even to debunk it. Try to tell them the correct information and then repeat it if you can. Another thing they point out is what they call the overkill backfire effect. So if you talk too much about something or give too many facts, it kind of overwhelms the mind. The brain has a difficult time processing a lot of stuff. And already, I mean, when we're talking about conspiracy theories, one of the, I guess, selling points of a conspiracy theory is it's clean, it's simple, it's easy to remember. And a lot of complicated, complex, boring information is not clean and simple and easy to remember. And also they said that when you go on too much and when you say too much, it's kind of like, why would you make such a complete case of it? The mind wants to naturally reject it as kind of like thou doth protest too much. So their suggestion is that you try to be brief and informative and say the most salient, important things. One of the things that's wrong with the worldview backfire effect is that people's worldview is kind of tied up to their own identity. So when you're attacking a piece of information that is part of their worldview or a manifestation of their worldview, then you're in a sense attacking their identity. And so there's a really strong desire to defend it, and thereby strengthening their belief in their worldview and their belief in whatever conspiracy theory or whatever they're saying. And when something is part of their worldview, the confirmation bias comes into play, where they're essentially looking for information that confirms what they already believe, and they're automatically discounting or dismissing or discrediting information that doesn't conform to what they believe. One of the experiments they did was they present people with opposite views of some issue like gun control or something, and they give them plenty of information on both sides of the issue. And then afterwards, they test them how strongly they believe, before and after. They test them how strongly they believe in what they already believed. And it turns out that even reading pros and cons, both groups come out believing even stronger in what they already did believe, because the confirmation bias. So they're discounting all the counter arguments, and they are affirming the arguments in favor of what they already believe are just confirming and strengthening what they already know. So even though they're getting a balanced view here, they come out even more biased. So how do you disabuse somebody of that kind of belief? They said, first thing to remember is that this is most effective. This worldview backfire effect is most effective with somebody who has a really strong belief. So there's a lot of people that are not really committed believers, and they're easier to affect. It's easier to correct their misinformation if they're kind of on the fence about it. Another thing they suggest is that studies have shown that when people get some kind of self-affirmation, they become less resistant to new ideas. So anything that makes the other person feel good about themselves. So we're back with Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. Basic human relations is you help them feel good about themselves, and you allow them to save face, and those things let them open their minds a little more than they would otherwise. They feel more comfortable. They feel more relaxed when you're introducing information that might threaten their worldview. So self-affirmation, or affirming them, their self, not yours, when you're trying to affect somebody. They also pointed out that studies had shown that it was more effective, this self-affirmation thing was more effective on people whose self-identity was strongly tied into their worldview, which makes sense. If you're threatening their worldview, their self-identity is being threatened. If you can relax their defensiveness about their own identity, their own self-worth, then they would be more receptive and more open to new ideas. Another thing they found is that you can frame your ideas in such a way that they're less threatening to their worldview. And they used an example. They said Republicans are far more likely to accept an otherwise identical charge as a carbon offset rather than a tax, because in their worldview, taxes are just wrong. So that's a suggestion they have, is that you can try to frame the way you say something so that it's not so threatening to their worldview. Try to actually see if you can figure out what their worldview is and how somebody from in that worldview could accept this information, and then try that. I think you can consider this podcast a kind of coaching. And, coaching is best while you're getting your feet wet doing something, right? If you're so you do it for a little bit, you get a little more coaching, you do it some more, you get a little more coaching. So if you have somebody that you're trying to change their mind, so have a conversation with them, listen to this and have a conversation with them, and then listen to this again and have another conversation with them I'm talking about over days, and just keep getting this coaching. So the memory is not that great, human memory. And if I can quote from my own book, Self-Help Stuff That Works, according to the International Listening Association, within 24 hours, we forget half of any information we've heard. 48 hours later, we've forgotten 75% of it, and we don't grasp everything we hear in the first place. But of course, those numbers change when something is repeated. So I suggest you listen to this, have a conversation, listen to this again, try again, listen to this again, try again, and this information or this coaching that these ideas that these researchers have figured out will become integrated more and more into the way that you're interacting, so that it comes out naturally. You're not trying to remember something, but it just is a natural way you're looking at this interaction and responding. One of the things that you have to deal with when you're giving somebody new information, or actually when you're saying that what somebody believes is wrong, is you have to give them something to replace it, so that whatever they believe is an explanation for why something happens. So you need to give them a plausible explanation that fills that gap. People do not like having no gap in causality. In other words, they need an explanation. And if all you do is tell them that their explanation is wrong without giving them a right explanation, then later when they're asked about it, they fall back on the only explanation they have for it. So you have to replace that explanation, their explanation, with a new one. So you're not just debunking what they believe, you're actually giving them a correct explanation. And the studies show that that works a lot better than just making their own explanation wrong. Another thing you can do as an alternative narrative is to explain why the misinformer promoted the myth in the first place. If you can do that, it often casts suspicion on the motives of that person, and studies show that that can really help somebody let go of a piece of information. Researchers have also found that visual information really helps correct people's misinformation. So if you can show graphs or something that represents it visually. They've also found, I don't know if this will help you any, but they've also found when somebody is first exposed to information, if they are suspicious to begin with, if they're doubting or skeptical to begin with, it's a lot easier to change their mind later. But if they accept it and are believers right off the bat, it's harder to change their mind later. Okay, that's about all they had in their study about what they found was effective. But as I said in some of the earlier podcasts I made about conspiracy theories and the people who believe them, that one of the common characteristics of people who believe in conspiracy theories is a feeling of powerlessness. And it occurred to me that you could actually do something about that. So if it's somebody that you love, you got to think that at some level they must feel powerless about something. And I thought, well, there's things you could do about that to make them feel less powerless. And they've shown in studies that when people feel less powerless, they are less committed to conspiracy theories. They believe them less. So I was thinking one of the things is there's an organization called Represent.us, and they're actually doing something about corruption. And that's usually what it seems to me most of the conspiracy theories that I've heard have to do with corruption. It's powerful people taking advantage of the fact that they have power. People don't like that, obviously, and there's all these conspiracy theories about it, and people get fixated on that because it's wrong. But sharing conspiracy theories that nobody believes, or very few people believe, and then not voting doesn't do anything about it. But there is an organization called Represent.us that is doing something about it. And you could, if you have somebody that believes in conspiracy theories, you could sell them on doing something, participating, volunteering, sharing posts or whatever from Represent.us. They have a website. They make great videos. They have a Facebook page and so on. So that's one thing I was thinking could be done. This is not in the study. I'm no longer talking about that study. I've told you everything that's worthwhile in that study, or everything I thought was worthwhile. So now I'm saying I've given it further thought, and I think there are other things that we could do to help somebody we know and love become less committed to conspiracy theories. Here's another one. You could help them become more successful in whatever way you can. And the more successful they are, the more in control of their life they are, in control of their own fate, the less likely they are to believe in conspiracy theories. Simple encouragement would probably help them become more successful. Another angle we can look at this is that most people who believe in conspiracy theories measure higher on levels of anxiety. So you could do something to help them become less anxious. So one of the best things you could probably do is, there's a really good book that anybody that is dealing with anybody that's got anxiety should read. It's called Feeling Good, The New Mood Therapy by David Burns. And he talks in there about the 10 cognitive distortions. Like, there are things that people do in their brains that are they're common mistakes that our brains tend to make. He's got a list of them, like all or nothing thinking, for example, is one of them, or overgeneralization. These are things that the brain naturally does, and when they do them, when the brain does this, it has a tendency to create anxiety and depression. So one of the things you could do to lower somebody you know and love's anxiety level is you read that book, Feeling Good, the New Mood Therapy, and learn about it, and then teach that person about it and help them become, this is something that people can do on their own. You can learn these 10 cognitive distortions, and you can change the way that you think so that you have less of that in your thinking. And if you do that, you will measurably be less anxious. And another thing you could probably do with somebody you know and love to lower their anxiety level is to build their confidence in some way, however you can. Speaking of Dale Carnegie, I remember a long time ago, I was afraid of speaking in public. I was on the anxious end when I was speaking in public, and I took the Dale Carnegie course in public speaking, and it was great. It was such a great way to get over that fear. They do it progressively, very, very slowly and gradually. So the first time that you speak, you get up there with 4 other people, and you're just sitting on a table in front of the group, and the trainer just asks each of you some questions like, where are you from, and stuff like that. Real easy, super easy, but you've now been in front of the group, right? And then it slowly goes from there until eventually you're speaking up there by yourself, and then eventually you're speaking up there by yourself on a speech that you created, and so on. They take it really slowly and very gradually, and by the end of that thing, I was perfectly comfortable standing in front of a group talking. I never would have thought that was possible even. So anything that you can do to build up somebody's confidence would make them feel less anxious. And we can safely assume that if they feel less anxious, they'll be less of a committed believer in conspiracy theories. So this whole thing has been about how do you influence somebody? How do you influence the way somebody thinks? So if somebody is misinformed, you're trying to correct their misinformation, you're trying to influence them. And there are 2 really good books I can recommend to you about influencing people. One of them is called Influence by Robert Cialdini, Cialdini. And his second book, it's called Persuasion, Pre and then dash suasion. It's what to do before the persuasion even starts, to prime their mind to hear what you have to say. And these are both great. And he bases all his work on scientific findings and what works in the real world. Fantastic books. You want to influence somebody, you should read these books. They're also fascinating. Okay, that's about all I have to share with you at the moment. I wish you the best of luck in making this world a more informed place. This is Adam Lee Kahn on The Atom Bomb.